The house was everything they had dreamed of. 2 stories of modern elegance nestled within a quiet cul-de-sac in Silver Oak Estates. The driveway was wide enough for 2 cars, the backyard spacious, and the neighborhood itself seemed like the perfect place to settle down. Mark and Tony Washington had spent years saving for this moment, enduring cramped apartments and noisy streets, waiting for the day they could finally call a place their own. As they pulled into their driveway for the first time, Tony took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle in. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with excitement and a tinge of disbelief. Mark grinned, stepping out of the car and stretching his arms. Home sweet home. The sun was high, casting golden light over the well-manicured lawns and the rows of nearly identical houses, each neatly maintained. A few neighbors were outside, some tending to their gardens, others walking their dogs. It felt idyllic, the kind of place where people waved at each other in the mornings and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. As they began unloading boxes, a couple from across the street approached. A middle-aged black woman with warm eyes and a tall, bespectacled man who gave off the air of a college professor. "Welcome to the neighborhood," the woman called out with a wide smile. "I'm Elena, and this is my husband, Derek. We live right there." She pointed to a cream-colored house with deep blue shutters. Tony beamed. "It's so nice to meet you. We've been looking forward to getting settled in." Derek nodded approvingly. "You're going to love it here. It's quiet, safe, and most of the neighbors are great. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to knock." The warmth in their welcome put Tony at ease. They made small talk for a few minutes, chatting about the area, the best local restaurants, and the upcoming neighborhood block party. Everything seemed perfect. Until the next neighbor arrived. She walked toward them with a clipped, purposeful stride, her posture rigid, her sharp blue eyes scanning them as if already making assessments. Her platinum blonde bob was immaculate, not a strand out of place, and her crisp white blouse seemed too formal for a casual afternoon. "Hello," she said, her smile tight, barely reaching her eyes. "I'm Karen Hollister. I live 2 houses down." Her gaze flickered to their moving truck, to the boxes on the lawn, to the car parked in the driveway. Tony extended her hand. "Nice to meet you, Miss Hollister." Karen hesitated a fraction too long before shaking it, her grip cool and brief. "Welcome to Silver Oak Estates," she said, her tone void of the warmth Elena and Derek had shown. "This is a wonderful neighborhood. We have rules here to maintain a certain standard." Mark arched a brow. "Rules?" "Yes, the Homeowners Association has very clear guidelines on how properties should be maintained. We take pride in the aesthetic of our community." Her eyes lingered on their car again, as if assessing whether it belonged. Tony forced a smile. "That's great to know. We plan on taking good care of our home." Karen nodded stiffly. "I hope so. We work hard to keep things in order here." With that, she turned on her heel and strode back to her house. Elena exhaled audibly. "So, you've met Karen?" Derek chuckled under his breath. "Brace yourselves. She's the self-appointed enforcer of all things HOA related." Mark frowned. "She seems a little intense." "You have no idea," Elena said. "She's been here for years, and she thinks it's her personal mission to make sure every blade of grass is cut to exactly the right length. She reports people for the tiniest infractions, even things that aren't real violations." Derek sighed. "Just be careful with her. She's not just strict, she's selective, and she has her own idea of who belongs here and who doesn't." That last part hung in the air for a moment. Tony exchanged a glance with Mark, sensing the subtext. They had encountered people like Karen before, people who didn't openly voice their prejudice but let it seep through in coded language, in scrutinizing glances, in subtle ways that made it clear they were unwelcome. But they weren't going to let one difficult neighbor ruin their excitement. They spent the rest of the day unpacking, meeting a few more friendly neighbors, and enjoying the first evening in their new home. The next morning, they woke to find an official-looking letter taped to their front door. Notice of OA violation. Tony read it aloud, her voice rising with disbelief. Your front door mat does not comply with Silver Oak Estate's aesthetic standards and must be removed within 48 hours. She looked down at the mat, a simple beige rectangle with the words, "Bless this home," in cursive. Mark rubbed his temples. You think Karen did this? Tony let out a dry laugh. Who else? Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Another notice arrived, this time about the color of their mailbox, which, according to Karen, was not in harmony with the community's palate. Then came the complaint about them having guests over too frequently, followed by a passive-aggressive suggestion that parking their car in the driveway overnight was an eyesore. At first, they tried to ignore it. They double-checked the HOA guidelines and found no real basis for the complaints, but Karen's watchful eyes were always on them. One evening, as Tony stepped out to bring in the mail, she caught Karen standing at the end of their driveway, staring at the house with a look of barely concealed distaste. Tony met her gaze head-on. Is there something you need, Miss Hollister? Karen's smile was thin, almost smug. Just making sure everyone is following the rules. Tony's fingers tightened around the stack of mail. We are. Karen tilted her head slightly. For now. Then she turned and walked away. Tony exhaled slowly, gripping the letters in her hand. Among them was another violation notice. Mark stepped outside, sensing her tension. What now? Tony handed him the letter. She's not going to stop. Mark read the notice and shook his head. Let her try. But even as he said it, they both knew this was only the beginning. The idea came to Mark one morning as he stood in their backyard, sipping his coffee and staring at the empty patch of soil near the fence. The yard was already beautiful, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a wooden patio where he and Tony often sat in the evenings. But something was missing. A tree. Not just any tree, a magnolia. Growing up, his grandmother had a towering magnolia in her front yard, its wide, glossy leaves offering shade in the summer, and its white blossoms filling the air with their sweet, unmistakable scent. It was a tree that had seen generations of his family gather beneath it, sharing meals, telling stories, and celebrating milestones. To him, planting a magnolia wasn't just about adding greenery to their new home. It was about putting down roots in a place where they intended to stay. When he shared the idea with Tony over breakfast, she immediately loved it. That's perfect, she said, setting down her coffee. It'll make this place feel even more like home. That afternoon, they visited a local nursery and found the perfect magnolia sapling. The owner, an older black man named Mr. Carter, smiled approvingly as they told him their plan. That's a good tree, he said, inspecting the sapling. Magnolias are tough. They can weather storms and still bloom strong. Kinda like us, huh? Mark and Tony exchanged a look, both recognizing the unspoken meaning behind his words. By evening, they had the tree planted, its young branches stretching toward the sky as if eager to grow. As they watered the soil, Tony snapped a picture, already imagining how the tree would look years from now. It felt like a fresh start. The feeling didn't last long. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. A neatly folded piece of paper was taped to their front door, just like the previous violation notices. Notice of OA infraction. Your recently planted tree does not comply with Silver Oak Estates' landscape uniformity policy. Please remove it within 7 days to avoid further fines. Tony read it out loud, her voice dripping with disbelief. What landscape uniformity policy? Mark clenched his jaw. There is no landscape uniformity policy. It was obvious who was behind this. Karen. She hadn't said a word about the tree in the days after they planted it, but they had seen her watching from her window, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Now she was escalating. Mark grabbed his phone and pulled up the HOA handbook they had received when they moved in. He scrolled through the pages, searching for any mention of tree restrictions. Nothing. "She's making this up," he said, tossing his phone onto the counter. "She has no real authority to make us remove it." Tony exhaled sharply. "Then we fight it." They sent an email to the HOA board that night, attaching photos of the tree and requesting a formal clarification of the supposed rule. By the next morning, they had a response. The HOA board has no existing policy restricting trees on private property. If you have received a notice suggesting otherwise, please disregard it. We will look into the matter further. Relief washed over Tony. So that's it. She loses this round. Mark wasn't so sure. That night, the camera on their backyard motion sensor flickered on. At 2:13 a.m., a figure crept into their yard, moving cautiously toward the magnolia tree. The infrared footage showed her face clearly. Karen. She was wearing a hooded jacket, gloves on her hands as she bent down near the base of the tree. From her pocket, she pulled out a small container and poured its contents onto the soil. She repeated the process around the entire base before straightening up, dusting off her hands, and slipping back through the yard. The next morning, Tony noticed it first. "The leaves," she said, standing over the magnolia, "they're turning brown." Mark crouched beside her, running his fingers through the damp soil. A faint chemical smell lingered in the air. "She poisoned it," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Tony's eyes burned with anger. "We have proof this time." They didn't waste a second. Mark called the HOA board, sending them the security footage. He followed up with an email to the city's property damage department, attaching the video as evidence of intentional harm. Then he called the police. Officer Patel and Officer Jenkins arrived within the hour, reviewing the footage with furrowed brows. "This is criminal mischief," Patel confirmed. "It's one thing to report a neighbor to the HOA, but damaging their property? That's an offense." Mark's jaw was tight. What happens now? Jenkins took notes. "We'll take her statement, and if she denies it, we'll let her know there's security footage proving otherwise." Tony crossed her arms. "And what about the tree?" Patel crouched near the magnolia, sniffing the soil. "I'd recommend calling a specialist. Depending on what she used, the tree might be savable." After the officers left, Mark wasted no time contacting an arborist. When Dr. Simmons arrived later that day, she knelt beside the tree, inspecting the damage. "You caught it early," she said. "The poison hasn't fully seeped in yet, but it's going to take a lot of work to save it. You'll need to flush the soil, treat the roots, and monitor it for the next few months." Mark exhaled. Whatever it takes. Dr. Simmons left them with detailed instructions on how to counteract the poisoning. It would be a process, but the tree had a chance. Later that evening, as Tony stood by the kitchen window, she noticed Karen outside. She was in her driveway, talking to one of the other neighbors, her expression as smug as ever. "She doesn't think she's done anything wrong," Tony said, shaking her head. Mark wrapped an arm around her waist. She thinks she can get away with it. Tony looked back at the tree. She won't, because this time they weren't just going to sit back and let her win. They were going to fight. The morning after their report to the police, Mark and Tony woke up to find their neighborhood buzzing with speculation. News of Karen's nighttime sabotage had spread quickly, and while some neighbors pretended not to have an opinion, others were openly taking sides. Elena and Derek came by later that morning, their expressions filled with concern. "You two okay?" Elena asked. Mark exhaled, glancing toward the backyard where the magnolia stood under careful treatment. "We will be." Derek shook his head in disbelief. "I knew Karen was petty, but this is next-level insanity." Elena folded her arms. "So what now?" "We're pressing charges," Tony said firmly. "The police have the footage. HOA knows what happened. She's not getting away with this." Elena nodded in approval. "Good, because she needs to face consequences." But while Mark and Tony were prepared for legal action, they weren't prepared for what Karen did next. That afternoon, Mark received an email from the HOA. Urgent notice. Neighbor complaint received. A formal complaint has been filed against you for maintaining hazardous landscaping. You are required to trim or remove any trees that may pose a risk to neighboring properties. Tony read over his shoulder, her fingers tightening into fists. "Are you kidding me? This is about the magnolia." Mark's jaw clenched. "She's trying to flip the script. She's the one who tried to destroy our tree, and now she's making us the problem?" Without hesitation, he called James, the HOA president. "I was expecting your call," James said, his tone weary. "Listen, I saw the footage you sent. Karen is out of line, way out of line. But she's making this official now." Mark ran a hand over his face. "What does that mean?" "She's claiming your tree is poorly maintained and poses a hazard to the community. Normally, this would be a non-issue, but now that it's been tampered with, she's using the weakened condition as her argument." "She's the reason it's weakened in the first place," Tony snapped. James sighed. "I know. The board knows. But we have to follow process. There's a hearing scheduled in 2 days to determine if the tree needs to be removed." Mark barely kept his voice steady. "We're not cutting it down." "I know, but Karen is doubling down. You should prepare yourselves." And double down she did. That night, as Mark and Tony were unwinding on the couch, the sound of tires screeching to a stop outside made them both jump. Karen was standing on their front lawn. Before Mark could reach the door, she started yelling, "You think you can ruin my life? You think you can turn people against me?" Neighbors peeked out from their houses. Some stepped onto their porches, watching the scene unfold. Mark stepped outside, keeping his voice even. "Karen, go home." "I am home," she shot back. "Unlike you, I actually belong here. You and your little wife think you can come in, change things, push me out?" Tony appeared beside Mark. "You need to leave, now." Karen's eyes burned with rage. "This isn't over. I have every right to protect this community." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house. Mark let out a slow breath. "She's losing it." Tony shook her head. "No, she's getting desperate." The next morning, they found the magnolia covered in a crude sign, "Remove the tree or else." Mark immediately called the police again, and this time Officer Patel wasn't amused. "This is harassment," she said, taking pictures. "She's escalating. If she steps onto your property again, we can arrest her." The officers visited Karen's house, and while she wasn't arrested that day, the warning was clear. But Karen didn't need to trespass to keep the pressure up. At the HOA hearing 2 days later, she came armed with printed documents, photos, and a rehearsed speech. "The Washington's tree is a danger," she declared. "It's damaged. It could fall in the next storm. The roots could interfere with underground pipes. The HOA must act before there's an accident." Mark stood to counter her argument. "The tree is under professional care. It's being treated. The only reason it's in this state is because she tried to destroy it." James nodded. "And we have video evidence confirming that." Karen's face tightened, but she pressed on. "Even so, we must consider what's best for the entire community. Many of us feel that this tree is an eyesore and a risk." "Many of us?" Tony repeated. "Or just you?" Some board members exchanged looks. Elena and Derek sat in the audience along with a few other supportive neighbors, but some residents seemed hesitant, unwilling to speak up against Karen. The debate dragged on for nearly an hour. Finally, James made his decision. "The HOA will not require the tree's removal. The Washingtons are within their rights to keep it, as long as it remains properly maintained." Karen's lips thinned. "You'll regret this," she muttered under her breath as she stormed out. Mark knew then that this wasn't over, but even he didn't expect what she would try next. The storm rolled in on a Sunday night. The wind howled, rain pelted the streets, and lightning split the sky. Mark and Tony were inside, sipping tea and watching a movie when the power suddenly flickered out. "Great," Tony muttered. "How long do you think it'll be this time?" Mark grabbed his phone to check the outage report when a sudden noise outside made him pause. A low, grinding hum, then the unmistakable roar of a chainsaw. Mark bolted upright. He ran to the back door, throwing it open just as lightning illuminated the yard. There, in the downpour, was Karen. Drenched from head to toe, goggles strapped to her face, she held a chainsaw in both hands, its blade biting into the trunk of their magnolia. She had already made progress. A deep gash marred the tree's side. Tony screamed. "Are you insane?" Mark grabbed his phone, hitting 911 as he stepped toward her. "Put it down, Karen." She barely looked at him. "This tree doesn't belong here. You don't belong here." Sirens wailed in the distance. Karen lifted the chainsaw again, but before she could do more damage, flashing red and blue lights filled the yard. Officers poured in, weapons drawn. "Drop it, now." For the first time, Karen hesitated. Then, finally, she let go. The chainsaw hit the wet grass with a thud. She turned toward the officers, her face blank, her body shivering. "You don't understand," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I was just protecting our neighborhood." Officer Patel snapped cuffs onto her wrists. "Karen Hollister, you're under arrest for criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and harassment." Tony wrapped her arms around herself, barely processing what had just happened. Mark's eyes stayed locked on the tree. The gash was deep. Maybe too deep. A week later, the arborist confirmed their fears. The magnolia couldn't be saved. Karen hadn't just tried to intimidate them. She had killed their tree. The morning the tree was scheduled for removal, the sky was overcast, thick clouds hanging low over Silver Oak Estates. Mark stood in the backyard, hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring at the wounded magnolia. The gash in its trunk was still raw, an ugly scar where Karen's chainsaw had bitten deep. It was a strange kind of grief, the loss of something that wasn't just wood and leaves, but a symbol of their home, their roots, their defiance against someone who had tried to erase them. Tony stepped beside him, slipping her fingers through his. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. They both knew what today meant. By noon, the tree removal team arrived. The workers moved with quiet efficiency, securing ropes around the magnolia's trunk and positioning their equipment. The saws roared to life, and with each cut, Mark felt a dull ache in his chest. When the final section of the tree was lowered onto the ground, a hush fell over the yard. The empty space where the magnolia had stood looked wrong, like something vital had been ripped away. Tony exhaled slowly. "It's done." Mark nodded, but it didn't feel like closure. As the workers packed up, neighbors started trickling into the yard. Elena and Derek were the first to arrive, followed by a few others who had supported them throughout the ordeal. Even Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow from down the street, made her way over, carrying a tray of homemade cornbread. "I know it won't bring back your tree," she said gently, "but I figured you could use a little comfort food." Mark smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." James, the HOA president, arrived last, carrying a folder under his arm. He looked tired but relieved. "I wanted to give you an update," he said, addressing both Mark and Tony. "Karen won't be coming back." Tony's eyebrows lifted. "She sold the house that fast?" James nodded. "Her attorney negotiated a deal. Part of her plea agreement includes selling her property and agreeing to have no further contact with anyone in this community. She's gone." Mark let out a slow breath. "Good," Elena smirked. "I can't say I'll miss her." Derek snorted. "I can't say anyone will." Despite everything, Mark didn't feel triumph, just relief. Karen had been a force of chaos from the moment they arrived, but now she was just gone. Tony glanced toward the empty patch of soil. "We need a new tree." Elena nodded. "Absolutely, and we're all going to help plant it." A week later, Mark found himself standing in a different nursery, this time accompanied by a man he had never expected to meet. Richard Hollister, Karen's ex-husband. The middle-aged man had shown up unannounced on their doorstep 3 days earlier, his expression one of quiet remorse. He had explained that while he and Karen had been divorced for years, he had heard about her actions and was horrified. "I can't undo what she did," he had said, "but I'd like to help make things right." Mark had been wary at first, but when Richard had offered to cover the cost of a new tree, one chosen from a specialized nursery that cultivated historical specimens, he had agreed. And now they stood together, surveying the rows of young saplings. "This one," Mark finally said, stopping beside a 15-year-old magnolia. It wasn't as tall as the one Karen had destroyed, but its branches were strong, its leaves a deep, healthy green. The nursery owner nodded approvingly. "A good choice. This one comes from a long line of old southern magnolias. It'll grow fast." Richard pulled out his checkbook. "Consider it covered." Mark hesitated before speaking. "Why are you doing this?" Richard sighed, running a hand over his salt and pepper beard. "Because Karen didn't just hurt you. She hurt this whole community. And because I know that sometimes the best way to fix something is to plant new roots." The day of the new tree's planting turned into an impromptu neighborhood event. Neighbors gathered in the backyard, bringing food, drinks, and even decorations, small paper lanterns to string along the fence. Elena and Derek helped Mark position the tree in the center of the yard, while a few of the kids from down the street eagerly scooped dirt around its base. When the last bit of soil was packed in, James stepped forward with something in his hands, a small bronze plaque. "We thought this might be a good addition," he said, handing it to Mark. The inscription read, "In honor of new beginnings and the strength of community." Tony smiled as she read it. "It's perfect." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark and Tony stood side by side watching their new magnolia. This one would take time to grow, but it would stand, and it would bloom, just like them. What a story, right? If you enjoyed this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful tale. We've got more eye-opening stories just like this coming your way. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in this situation? And don't forget to check out our other videos for more gripping stories about justice, resilience, and community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.